My name is Hannah, if you don't know me. I'm a student here at Redemption. I'm a senior in high school, and this fall I'm heading to Cedarville University, so Stingham. But I'm also an intern here at Redemption, and like Anthony said, we are in the middle of a series called This Is Why. And the reason that we're taking 5 weeks to do this is because we're excited about this youth group, right? When your youth leaders and when the staff and when the worship team, when we get here every Wednesday, we're excited, right? We know that what happens in this room on Wednesday nights is important, and we want you guys to know that too. So a couple weeks ago, Stephen kicked us off. He talked about community. What does that look like? Why is it important? How can we be a family to each other as a youth group? And then last week, Anthony was up here. He talked about pursuing Jesus. What does that mean? What does it look like? How can we do that as individuals and as a community? And tonight, I get to talk to you guys about worship. So there are 3 main things that I want to hit. I want to talk about, well, what is worship? Because we talk about it a lot and we use that word a lot, but what does it actually mean? And then second, how can we worship properly? Right? And the great thing about this question is that Jesus actually talks about it himself. So we can look at that and what he has to say. And then third, why do we worship? As an individual, why do I worship? Why do you worship? And as a group, why is it important for us to worship together? So those are the 3 things I want to hit. That's the game plan. And we're going to start at the beginning with number 1. What is worship? Well, Hebrews 12:28 gives us a pretty good idea of this. It says, "Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us be thankful and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe." Have you ever been in awe of someone? Right? Maybe it's your favorite singer, maybe it's a professional athlete, but they do something so well, and it's amazing, and you just see it, and you're like, man, that's incredible. So when you're in awe of someone, what do? Well, maybe if it's a singer, you buy a concert. You want to go to their show and see them perform live. If it's an athlete, you go to a game. You want to see them play. And why do we do that? Well, because when someone can do something incredible, you want to see it for yourself. You want to get up close and personal. You want to experience that. And it's the same thing with worship. When we see what God can do, when we're amazed by it, we want to get close to him. We want to see that for ourselves. And everything that we do when we say, God, you're here, and I'm just focused on you, and I want to see what you can do. That's worship. Worship is when we see what God has done for us, we're amazed by it, and we have this reverence and awe for him. And everything that we do because of that, everything that we do to get closer to him, that's what worship is. And number 2, how do we worship properly? If the Bible talks about worship a lot, then it's probably important. If every Wednesday night and every Sunday morning we take time to worship, then it's probably important. If we have a team of people that shows up every Sunday morning and every Wednesday night and practices and takes time out of their day to be here and do this, then it's probably important. And if it's important, then it's worth doing right. So we're going to look at John chapter 4. And what this is, it's this really famous story about Jesus meeting a woman at a well. There's a lot of stuff going on here. There are a lot of different things that we could pay attention to. But Jesus talks about worship. And so we're going to read those few verses, starting in verse 19. The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." All right, so this woman is a Samaritan, and Jesus is a Jew. And the Jews and the Samaritans do not like each other. There's a lot of conflict between these 2 groups, right? Some of it is racial, some of it is cultural, but a lot of it has to do with religion. And the Samaritans have this very specific idea of how you're supposed to worship God on this mountain where we live. And then the Jews also have a very specific idea of how you're supposed to worship God in the temple in Jerusalem. And so this woman is talking to Jesus, and what she's saying is kind of like, well, my people do it this way. We've always done it this way. We like doing it this way, but you guys have an entirely different idea. What's up with that? Which one of us is right? And our arguments don't really look the same nowadays, right? I don't know about you guys. I've never started an argument over whether you need to be in the temple in Jerusalem to worship God. But we do still have different ideas about what worship is, right? And you see some of this. If you go to a church on Sunday, it might be Hillsong. And if you go to the church down the road, they might be singing hymns. And our worship can look a lot different depending on where we are. It can be different styles of music, different volume, the stage can look different. And if we're not careful, we can start to say the same thing that the Samaritan woman is saying to Jesus. I do it this way. I like doing it this way. So why are they doing it differently? And a lot of us in this room probably have a pretty similar idea of what worship is. And the reason for that is that we are in here on Wednesday nights and Sunday mornings. We're experiencing the same thing, right? It's the same songs. It's the same people singing them. And we have similar ideas. But we're not the only church out there, right? I looked it up the other day. I don't know if I believe this or not, but apparently there are over 300 churches in Toledo. And so if you were to pick any one of those churches, show up on a Sunday, and see what worship is like there, it would probably be different. It might be a little different from what we do here at Redemption. It might be a lot different. But we all kind of have our own ideas about this and all our different methods of worshiping. And if we're not careful, we can get so attached to them that we're willing to divide over them, that they're willing to say, I do it this way, and you're doing it that way, so that must be wrong. And that's what the Samaritan woman is saying to Jesus right now. So let's look at what he says. In verse 21, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews." All right, so a few years ago, I had a really bad argument with my best friend. My best friend, her name is Olivia. She's really short. That doesn't matter for anything, but she is. And we've been best friends for like 8 years. We've known each other since we were really little. We've gone on family vacations together. Like, we're super tight-knit. And we had this really horrible fight, you guys. And we don't fight often, so it was kind of a big deal. But like, she was crying. We were barely speaking to each other. It was really bad. And you might be asking, like, what were you fighting over? What was so important that you were barely speaking to your best friend? And to answer your question, we had different ideas on how you were supposed to pronounce the name of a pasta. So I said penne, which is correct, and she said penny, like the coin. I won that argument. But if you're a reasonable person, you're probably thinking, Hannah, that doesn't matter. Why would you start an argument over something that small? And that's kind of what Jesus is saying to this woman here, right? This woman is trying to talk about the disagreements about the methods of worship. She's trying to say, I do it here, but you guys do it over there. And what Jesus is saying is, no, like that doesn't matter. It's not important. Stop focusing on that. And what Jesus says in verses 23 and 22, you worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming, and is now here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. This woman is trying to talk to Jesus and say, hey, I do it this way, but they do it that way. And Jesus is saying, no, stop paying attention to that. It's not the point. And this is what he says worship is. Worship is something that we do in spirit and truth. That's what makes worship worship. And so what does that mean? Well, let's start with spirit. To worship in spirit means that we're completely engaged, right? In that moment, nothing is more important to us. It has our full attention. We're not thinking about the phone in our pocket. We're not thinking about the plans that we have afterwards. We're just completely there. Have you ever had a conversation with someone and you can tell that their head isn't in it? Like they're somewhere else. They're not paying attention to what you're saying. So I had kind of a similar experience to that. It was about a month ago. We were upstairs, me and 3 other people, and we were painting the loft. And so it was Anthony, Josh, and the other Josh. I think they're all here tonight. You know where this is going. But the 4 of us were having this conversation. And eventually what it turned into was the 3 of them having this debate over who the best quarterback in NFL history was. And if you know me at all, you can probably guess what I was doing. I was standing off to the side over here, and I'm like, okay, how long? How long is this going to last? Because who cares about football? I just offended some of you. But I don't really care about football, right? I didn't watch it growing up. I was a gymnast. So they cared about this, and they were super engaged in it. But I just wasn't. And then a couple minutes later, this amazing thing happened, you guys. They stopped talking about football, and they started talking about gymnastics. And it was like the light bulb moment where I was like, oh, I can be part of this conversation now. And we all have our different things that we get excited about, right? For me, it's gymnastics. For them, it was football. I don't know what it is for you, but we all have our things that we're passionate about. And when someone is really engaged, when their heart is in something, you can just tell. You can see it. Like, if you were here on Sunday and you heard Stephen talking about puppy chow, you know what I mean. Like, you can tell when people love what they're doing. And that's what it means to worship in spirit. It means that when we're worshiping, we're entirely engaged. We're all there. Our heart is in it. And then we have to worship in truth. That's the other half of this. So what truth is, worshiping in truth means two things. It means we know who we're worshiping, and we know why we're worshiping. Right? This is why we sing songs like Living Hope. And they just tell the story of the gospel. And we sing songs like Great Things that just talk about who God is. Because this whole thing is about God. Worship is about us being reverent and awe of God. And so we need to know who he is and what he did for us in order to worship in truth. And if you think about it, Jesus is really smart about the way that he defines worship. He's really smart about giving these two things, spirit and truth. Because most of us have a natural inclination to either focus on the spirit and not really the truth, or to focus on the truth and not really the spirit. And so what we can do, we're all the way over here, if we're just focusing on the spirit and we're so engaged, right? You can be raising your hand, you can be jumping around, you can be up at the altar, you can be doing all of the things that look like worship. But if you're not worshiping because of the truth, there's no substance to it. And service ends, and you walk out those doors, you go home and nothing has changed. You still act the same way, you still think the same way, because worship, if you don't have truth, is just an emotional high. It's just something that we do to make ourselves feel good. It doesn't have anything to do with God. And so that's one extreme. But then we can also come over here, all truth and no spirit. And when you're over here, you can kind of look down on those people over there, right? Because you can tell they just don't get it. And so over here, you're focused on truth, right? Like, we sing a song around here a lot. It's called Christ Be Magnified. And one of the lyrics in it is, I won't be formed by feelings. I'll hold fast to what is true. And that's a good lyric, and the reason that we sing it is because you never want to be controlled by your emotions, right? You never want that to be the most important thing. And so it's good to focus on the truth. It's good to focus on the gospel and what the Bible says. But when you're over here, when you have truth without spirit, you can fall into another trap, as you make it all about yourself over here too, because you're just focusing on doing everything right. Right? Like, I have to know all of the words to those songs. I have to know all of the Bible verses that they're based on. I have to have all of the right theology, and if I just try hard enough, then I can do this worship thing right. And that's all about you too. And you're not experiencing worship because instead of saying, look what Jesus did, you're saying, look what I can do. Look how good I can worship. And that's not about Jesus either. You need spirit and you need truth. You need to be engaged, and the way that happens is you hear the gospel and it just touches you. You hear the story of how we dug ourselves a hole that we could never get out of. And then the God of the universe, the person who created all of this, sent his son down to suffer on a cross, to die the most horrible death anyone ever has, to save us. And you hear that and it sinks in. And when that happens, there is nothing else to do but worship, right? There's nothing else that we can do but just say, God, I don't know why you saved me, but now I just want to live for you. So that's what we need. We need spirit and truth, and the way that we get there is the gospel. It's all about the gospel. And this is really hard, guys. Like, honestly, it's really hard to worship because in order to worship, we have to humble ourselves. We have to be able to admit, like, I never could have done this on my own. I never could have been good enough to earn this grace. I never could have dug myself out of the hole that I dug. I never could have climbed out of the hole that I dug myself. Words are hard. I never could have done this on my own. Right? That's what we have to admit, and it's really hard to say that because we as people are really, really good at pretending that we have it all together right up until the moment that we can't anymore. And for me, that moment was a couple years ago. It was actually around this time, like March, April-ish of my sophomore year, and everything fell apart. Right? Part of it was COVID, like the entire world shut down, and I couldn't go to church, I couldn't see my friends, I couldn't even see my own siblings. Nothing felt normal anymore. And then during that same time, there were two communities that I was part of, that I'd been part of practically my entire life. One was an extracurricular activity, one was a church, and these places, these communities were my family. They were everything to me, and I couldn't imagine myself without them. And both of them, in the period of a month, I was not part of either. I was not part of them anymore. And then, during that same time, there was a relationship that I had with a really close friend of mine. Like one of my best friends, someone I talked to every single day, someone I could not have imagined life without, and they're not in my life anymore. And all of this happened in the period of like a month and a half maybe. And up until that point, like I was doing good. I had it figured out. Like I had the perfect grades, I had the perfect friend group. I was a good Christian, you know the good Christian thing, like, okay, God, that was really nice of you to send Jesus and die on the cross for me. You can have my Wednesdays and my Sundays. And I checked off all of the boxes, and I read my Bible, and I went to church, and I volunteered in kids' church, and I was on worship team. All right, I did all of the good Christian things. But then, when everything fell apart, when I was sitting by myself in my room, and I couldn't go to church, and I didn't even have a church to go to, that was when I learned to worship. Because for the first time, I got the gospel. The first time it made sense, like, I can't do this on my own. I never could have done this on my own. And when you realize that, those are the moments that you learn to worship. And maybe you've had a moment like this, and you can point back to it and say, yeah, that was when I realized how much I needed Jesus. Maybe you're in the middle of one of those moments right now, and you're like, I don't know what's happening in my life. I don't know what's going on. I just know that I can't do it by myself anymore. And those moments are when we learn to worship, because it's when we really understand how much we need Jesus. It's when we understand how much we've been given. We started this talk with Hebrews 12:28. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us be thankful, and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe. That's why we worship. It's not an item on this checklist that you need to do to be a good Christian. It's because we really need Jesus, and he really came through for us. And when you realize that, and when you realize how much that you've been given, there's just nothing else to say but thank you. Thank you, God. I just want to be close to you now. I just want to know you better. So at this point, you might be wondering, well, what does that have to do with Wednesday nights? Right? That kind of makes sense. Like, Jesus saved me, and so I should worship him as an individual. But what does that have to do with all of us here together on Wednesday night? And that's a good question, so we're going to answer it. There are three big things. The first is that the Bible tells us to. Right? In both the Old and the New Testament, both halves of the Bible, they talk a lot about worshiping together. Right now, on Sunday mornings, we're going through the book of Acts. And what it is, it's this book in the New Testament that is just all about the church being born. Just all about these people who saw what Jesus did for them and wanted to worship him. So that's the first reason. It's the first reason that we worship together, because the Bible tells us to. There's another one. We are talking about how you can either kind of be over here with the spirit but not truth, or you can be over here with the truth but not spirit. We all kind of have our natural inclination one way or the other. And what happens when we all come together and we worship together is we start to balance each other out. We remind each other of what we're missing. So if I'm over here and I'm just really engaged in the spirit, but I'm not focusing on what it's really about, maybe the worship leader quotes a passage of scripture. They say a prayer, and it just reminds you of the gospel and why we're here to begin with. Or maybe if I'm so focused on the words that I'm singing, maybe if I'm so focused on doing the right things in worship that I forgot, like, hey, this is really good. Like, I should be excited about this. Sometimes we do. One of you just does this. You raise your hand when you're worshiping for the first time. And you're not used to it, but there's just that spirit and that joy breaking in. That's what happens when we get together to worship, guys. We balance each other out. We learn how to worship from each other. Then number 3, this is one of the big ones. Our third why is because when we're all here together and we're focused on Jesus and what he did for us, all of the things that would normally separate us from each other, like, oh, they go to that school, or they play that sport, or they hang out with those people, all of those things stop mattering because worship shifts our focus away from ourselves and onto God. So then a new kid walks in on a Wednesday night, and they're coming from the cliquiest environment ever at their school. And they expect this to be the exact same way here. And they walk in, and they just see all of us here worshiping together. All of the people who have nothing in common, who would have no reason to be in a random building in Monclova on a Wednesday night spending time together. And we're all just here, and instead of paying attention to the things that make us different, we're just worshiping. We're just focusing on the person who brings us together. That's the kind of environment that people want in on, right? That's what makes someone think, maybe I will come back next week. Maybe this church thing could be important. Maybe this Jesus guy is someone I need. That's why worship matters, because it changes us as individuals. It makes us focus on Jesus. It brings us closer as a community. And it creates this culture that people on the outside, they look in and they go, what's going on there? That doesn't make sense. I don't understand that, but I kind of want in on it. And they say, I don't know what's going on in that building in the middle of the cornfields in Monclova, Ohio, every Wednesday night, but I want to know what's going on. I want to be part of that. It's just different, and I want in on it. 5 years from now, we want to be able to look back and say, you remember when we started? Remember when there were like 50 kids here every Wednesday night? But then new people just kept coming, and they kept coming back, and lives kept getting changed because when you walked through those doors on a Wednesday night at 7 o'clock, something was different, right? And people didn't necessarily get it at first. They're kind of confused, like, what's going on here? But they just wanted in on it. And this thing kept growing, and lives kept changing. That's the culture that we want to have around here. Now, every Wednesday night, when you show up and you worship next to the person who goes to your rival school, the person who you never would have been friends with outside of church, you are building that culture, right? That's why we want you guys to keep coming back every Wednesday night. That's why we think that worship is important. That's why we get excited about it, and it's why we want you guys to be excited about it too. Let's pray. God, thank you for this group of students. Thank you that you brought us all here tonight. God, I pray that as we keep getting together, you teach us how to worship you with spirit and truth. I pray that everything that could divide us, the differences we have, I pray that we would leave them at the door every Wednesday night. I pray that we keep growing as a community, and as that happens, you will bring more people in. You will keep changing more lives. God, please help us to always remember that this is about you and not us. Amen.